Hello, and welcome back to the Crime Reel. For this week's true crime narration, we shall be looking at the life and crimes of George Douglas Lott. George was born on the 7th of June 1947 in Okmulgee, Oklahoma. Around the time of his birth, his father, Doug, was stationed in Italy with the army, so his first home was with his mother, Nancy, and his maternal grandparents. His father later contracted polio and retired from the army. At this point, the family then moved to Fort Worth in Texas. George attended the Bluebonnet Elementary School, McLean Junior High, and Pascal High Schools before joining the Allen Military Academy in Bryan. It was here that one of our regular viewers, screen name Carl G, became friends with George. At this tough military school, it was, in his opinion, more difficult than the actual military. In 1966, George graduated from the military academy and enrolled at the Southern Methodist University in Dallas to study business. However, his studies were put on hold whilst he took time out to serve in Korea during the Vietnam War. He would eventually complete his degree in 1978, after which he enrolled at the University of Texas Law School in Austin. 3 years later, in 1981, he graduated and became a member of the State Bar of Texas. Soon after that, he met a 32-year-old law student by the name of Margot Livesey. The couple began dating and married in 1985. They purchased a house in Arlington, and shortly afterwards, Margot began working as an assistant professor of computer science at the University of North Texas in Denton. Around 1986, George had become increasingly disillusioned with the justice system and stopped paying his dues to the Texas Bar Association, which effectively ended his legal career. The following year, in the summer of 1987, George and Margot's only child, Neil, was born. Less than 6 months later, Margot filed for divorce, alleging that George was so threatening and violent that she required psychological counselling for the emotional distress. A bitter court battle followed, during which time George hired and sacked 3 lawyers before eventually deciding to represent himself. By this time, he had moved to an apartment in southeast Arlington. His neighbours described him as rude and aloof, making no attempt to engage in conversation. His time was spent fighting the divorce case and working for a brief period as a computer programmer. It is understood that he applied for upwards of 150 jobs during this period but was unsuccessful, so he lived off of the $500,000 inheritance which he had received, reportedly from his grandparents. George and Margot's divorce was finalised in January 1990. Margot gained custody of young Neil and was to be given $1,000 per month in support. George repeatedly challenged this outcome, but without success. The following year, Margot moved with Neil to Peoria in Illinois. Here, she reported that Neil was showing signs of abuse after visiting his father. George contested these allegations, but at a hearing in December 1991, a protective order was issued stating that all future visits between George and Neil would need to be supervised. George's father, Doug, who had seen George with his son the previous year, believed that he was a fantastic father and that Margot had made up these charges. George became increasingly angry at what he saw as the legal system failing him. During court appearances, he would often make underhanded and snide remarks aimed at the judges and prosecutors. In an attempt to resolve the situation, on 30th of June and early on 1st of July 1992, George made repeated calls to the felony clerk in Peoria, Illinois. He became increasingly angry and made various demands of the clerk, all of which were impossible for them to action. His hatred of the judicial system had reached boiling point. At around 10 a.m. on Wednesday the 1st of July 1992, 45-year-old George travelled to the Tarrant County Courthouse in Fort Worth. He went to the 4th floor and sat on a bench outside of the District Court of Appeals. Smartly dressed and holding his briefcase, he could easily have been mistaken for any one of the legal professionals who were busy at work that day. George then entered the courtroom, sat down and watched the proceedings for a few minutes. Presiding over the courtroom that day was a 3-judge panel consisting of Judge John Hill, Judge David Farris and Judge Clyde Ashworth. As defence lawyer, Dan Holyfield was standing at a lectern in the courtroom arguing a motion. George stood up, retrieved a 9mm automatic handgun from his briefcase and opened fire at the 3 judges on the bench. He then began walking down the central aisle of the courtroom, firing randomly. At least 17 bullets were discharged before he ran from the courtroom to make his escape via a nearby stairwell. He then encountered 33-year-old defence attorney John Edwards, who he shot repeatedly before fleeing the scene in a van which he had parked outside. John died from his injuries, leaving behind his wife and 3 young sons. The courtroom was in chaos. The judges appeared to be the primary targets of the attack. Judge John Hill was shot in the shoulder. Judge David Farris managed to dive behind the bench and was not injured. Judge Clyde Ashworth sustained a serious hip injury. Thankfully, all 3 judges survived the attack. Dan Holyfield, who had been presenting an argument when the shooting began, managed to escape by falling to the floor and crawling to an adjacent room. 41-year-old Assistant District Attorney Christopher Marshall, who had also been present, was shot multiple times in the chest and died at the scene. He left behind a wife and child. Another Assistant District Attorney, 28-year-old Steve Conder, was treated for a superficial leg wound. After the attack, George drove around aimlessly for several hours before arriving at the WFAA TV studios in Dallas. Upon arrival, he asked to speak to their veteran news anchor, Tracy Rowlett. George identified himself as the person who had completed the shooting at the courthouse before handing over the gun and being interviewed by Tracy. In the interview, he stated that he wanted to draw attention to the wrongs of the legal system. He said that his target was the judges, who had no involvement with any of his legal issues, but were a symbol of the system which he had come to despise so much. He reportedly told staff at the TV station that it was a horrible, horrible thing that I have done today, but you have to do horrible, horrible things to catch people's attention. At around 4:15 p.m, whilst in the process of being interviewed, George was arrested. When questioned by investigators, he refused to talk because he first wanted to see if he had got his point across in the TV interview. Regardless, the police charged him with capital murder, deadly assault on a court participant, and carrying a weapon in a prohibited place. He was denied bail. Despite his voluntary recorded confession, George later claimed that he was not guilty and represented himself at trial. He argued that the 9 witnesses, who had all identified him as the gunman, were mistaken, and his television interview was just an opportunistic attempt to gain publicity for his issues with the judicial system. On Friday, 12th of February 1993, George was found guilty of 2 counts of capital murder, and the following day was sentenced to death. George immediately stated that he would continue to represent himself and would appeal the decision. but he never filed the necessary paperwork to facilitate this. However, as it was a death penalty case, there was an automatic appeal which upheld the original decision. 19 months later, on 20th of September 1994, George was executed by lethal injection in Huntsville, Texas. He made no attempt to appeal or prevent the execution and made no final statement. He was pronounced dead at 12:19 a.m. At the time of the shooting, Tarrant Courthouse did not have metal detectors installed or any particular security measures in place. This was despite the fact that George was the fourth incident of an armed gunman in the courthouse since 1986, 3 of which had resulted in fatalities. In light of these and other such incidents, security measures have since dramatically changed. That concludes today's story on George Lott. Thanks very much for listening. Please leave any comments down below. You'll probably be aware I enjoy reading them. Thanks very much for listening to The Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye. Psst. Normally when I do the recordings, I do them very early in the morning. Today I had a bit of a snooze. So during this recording, I've had 5 deliveries, 5 ding-dongs, 5 separate recordings. I hope it wasn't too disjointed. Goodbye.